Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. About 2 weeks ago, I broke out in red spots all over, itchy spots. I looked ridiculous. In fact, in my last video, I was wearing a turtleneck and wearing makeup, something I very rarely do, to hide some of those spots. For years, I've had mild eczema that pops up with weather changes or exposure to specific allergens. Just a handful of times I've had more severe eczema flares, and that's what happened this time. While the itchiness was definitely part of the problem, even more was the lack of sleep I got due to that itchiness. And I'm a person who really needs her sleep because exhaustion leads me to both the trough of depression and to meanness to other people. During each of these flares, I've eventually taken myself to the doctor's office, asking for stronger treatment than the over-the-counter ointments and allergy pills that usually work just fine. With prescription strength treatment, I can control the discomfort enough that I can get some rest and stay as sane and calm as I can. When I talked with my doctor, she pointed out that I had come in for out-of-control eczema just a few times, but always in late October and early November, and she wondered if perhaps I was reacting to some seasonal allergy, some sort of leaf mold or something like that. She listed the years: 2016, 2020, and 2024. Election years. I've realized for quite a while that these flares seem to be related to stress, not just because the eczema leads to stress, but because stress leads to eczema. Stress is a common cause of eczema flares, or rather a common exacerbator of flares, and presidential elections have always been a source of stress. For years, they caused me a little stress that felt pretty close to excitement. In all of those elections, I had a very clear preferred candidate based on policies and approaches that I felt would be good for the people of the nation. But I didn't worry that the election of the other candidate, the candidate I didn't agree with and I didn't support, might threaten democracy and threaten our entire national project. But in the past few elections, that latter kind of worry has taken over for me and for many other voters, too. My doctor's office is in downtown Washington, D.C., near many government buildings. All over the place, buildings were boarded up and high anti-riot fences were being erected. People feared that there might be violence after the election. I, too, feared that. That was what was causing me the greatest stress, a fear that my neighborhood and my town and my nation might erupt in violence. I worried that one of the candidates might find a way to grab power, even if he didn't win the election. And I believed that the election was very close. I didn't want Harris to lose an election that looked, from most polls, almost like a coin toss. What I did not worry about is that Trump would win what looks like a very decisive victory, with a higher percentage of votes in almost every state than he received 4 years ago. I also was saddened that some of his support came from groups of voters I had hoped would oppose him: young voters, Latino voters, and a surprisingly high number of women, especially white women. I had intended to spend election night with my closest friends with whom I have watched presidential elections before and with whom I have spent many years celebrating everything from Passover to New Year's Eve and marking everything from the births of our children to the deaths of our most beloved family members. This election night, one family was going to set up a screen outside, and we were all going to sit around the fire pit, eat hummus and carrots, and drink our favorite beverages as we watched the returns slowly come in from each state. As it turned out, we've received so little rain here in these very warm recent days that our county has banned backyard fires. Well, my crazy itchiness and exhaustion coupled with the side effect of extra intense sleepiness that came from one of my new eczema meds, made me decide to stay home. After I made that decision, I chatted with Steve Donoghue, who encouraged me to turn off the news, take a walk outside in the sunshine, and then read all night. He knew I had been watching and reading political news obsessively for the preceding weeks, perhaps intensified because of my background as an historian, but definitely intensified by what is for me a brand new addiction to my phone, something I knew I needed to break. I was pretty good about Steve's edict to me, although I wound up sleeping far more than reading. I had given myself permission to turn on NPR, National Public Radio, at the top of each hour for its brief news roundup. And based on that, and the incoming texts from friends, which I also only checked at the top of the hour, I did know the basics of what was happening. And around 11:30 or so in the evening, I watched the news for about an hour and listened to a few trusted political commentators trying to make sense of what was happening and why it differed so much from what people on the left, like me, were hoping might happen. In his pre-election video, the young UK booktuber Joe Spivey highlighted a handful of journalists who had a lot to say about the election cycle, including Mehdi Hasan, whom I have appreciated for quite a while, as well as Brian Taylor Cohen, a more recent lefty follow for me, and also Tim Miller. Tim Miller is one of the journalists from The Bulwark, with its expansive collection of YouTube videos and podcasts and Substack mini essays. And its approach is not what I have usually consumed. My regular viewers know that while my in-person life is pretty deeply connected to politics, I try to steer away from these topics on YouTube. Still, many of you know that I have been a serious lefty all my life. The Bulwark is not a lefty group. I believe Tim Miller was a Romney Republican and now registered as an independent. Other journalists on that channel see themselves in that narrow middle aisle from center-right to center-left. And while I don't personally fit in that category at all, I find their discussions to be quite thoughtful and quite insightful. My favorites in that crowd, despite the fact that I see the world a bit differently, are Jonathan V. Last, who often goes by JVL, and Sarah Longwell. Sarah has a line she uses a lot, one that feels especially meaningful right now in a time of stress and sadness and fear. She says, "Let's all be together." She's speaking to her friends, and she's speaking to all the people of various political beliefs who have come together to appreciate their work. Let's all be together. That's the line to take as we go forward. Let's all be together, all people of goodwill, even when we come from different political lineages and approaches. In just a minute, I'm heading out to go meet friends for our long-standing weekly happy hour. Before the pandemic, we rotated whose house we went to. In early 2020, we started meeting on Zoom. We still meet on Zoom pretty regularly, partly so we can include an original member who now lives elsewhere, and partly to keep things as safe as we can for vulnerable members seeking to avoid COVID and other infections. That respect for vulnerable people allowed me to stay part of happy hour when my husband David's immune system was weakened from chemo. Let's all be together in whatever ways make sense to us. This afternoon, my happy hour group will meet outdoors in person, and I can't wait to be together with these old friends of mine. And of course, you are part of this all being together too. I've said many times before that I am still amazed that my circle of close friends now includes so many people I've never met in person, as well as several that I only met in person because of BookTube. And I am so grateful to have all of you here on this platform. The night after the election, I got together with some other local friends at the Folger Shakespeare Theater, where we have season passes together. Actually, our tickets were originally for a week or two ago, but one of my party became ill, and luckily we were able to reschedule our visit. As I was walking from my house to the nearby subway so I could head downtown, I passed the home of one of my neighbors, Jamie Raskin, the brilliant constitutional lawyer who is my representative in the U.S. House. He was first elected in 2016, on the same day of Trump's first election. When I was walking to the subway that morning in 2016, I ran into Raskin and offered him my congratulations on his election, even as we expressed our deep disappointment in the outcome of the presidential race that year. He told me it was time to work to protect the vulnerable people in our nation, and that we had more power than we might think, the power of the law and kindness to lead us forward. Jamie Raskin has done astonishing work over the years since that morning in 2016, and I'm glad he will continue to be my representative and my neighbor going forward. The play we saw was Romeo and Juliet. If you watch Angelia over at the wonderful channel Read and Reread, you'll know that she, her spouse, and commentator extraordinaire Michael Clark went to see it last week, right after the four of us had a lovely day together here in D.C. This production was not a typical production. It was specifically designed to be timely. First, the two households, the Montagues and Capulets, were feuding not so much because of some ancient grudge, but because of politics. One member of each house is a presidential candidate, vehemently opposed to the other side. And despite the promise of Shakespeare's prologue, what we see at the end of the staging is not in any way a form of buried strife. The show seeks to address other extremely contemporary issues as well, from issues of racial and ethnic conflicts, linguistic differences and immigration, and the way our society is lived aloud so publicly in social media. If you see a lot of contemporary productions of Shakespeare, you know that there is usually sort of an unwritten code. Actors have to use Shakespeare's actual words for what's spoken, at least the vast majority of the time. But you can include major changes if characters are singing or presenting some other kind of clear set piece, or if images or posters or whatever appear on the stage, or sometimes if something is said over a loudspeaker. This particular production goes very far along that path. Because the mother of one of the star-cast lovers is Puerto Rican, as is Juliet's nurse, a fair amount of their lines are translated into Spanish, and not always translated in a directly literal way. On top of that, there are digital projections showing visuals and sound and text, all introducing information that, of course, isn't in Shakespeare's original. Personally, I'm not upset at all with this kind of expansion of Shakespeare, and enjoy it often, but in this case at least, I found the chaotic flashiness a bit distracting. I want to talk just briefly about one addition I found especially intriguing. In order to create some of the fictive political footage, the director and his team took real-world speeches from Harris's convention speech at the DNC and Trump's at the RNC, as well as from campaign speeches by Vivek Ramaswamy or Oprah Winfrey, etc. But instead of using the actual syntax of the original speeches, the team reset them in blank verse in iambic pentameter. So they were statements that felt both very immediate and also remarkably Shakespearean. I wasn't utterly convinced by what they were doing, but I did find it really intriguing. After the show concluded, my friends offered me a ride home. We walked back to their car a few blocks away, talking about both her performance and about the ramifications of the election. And then we drove through the Capitol Hill section of Washington, D.C., from which one can look down the long, grassy strip of land we call the National Mall, all the way to the Washington Monument. As we pulled away from the neighborhood and headed toward my house, we suddenly saw a beautiful view of the Capitol itself from an angle I don't remember seeing. And it was glowing, with its dome emerging above everything. Thank you for joining me today, quote, being here together on this channel specifically, but also on BookTube more generally. You are part of my community, and I am very grateful. See you soon.